You see, when a narcissist hurts you and then goes silent, it's not a coincidence. It's not just emotional immaturity or some temporary mood swing. It's a calculated maneuver, a psychological tactic rooted in control. Silence, to the narcissist, is not absence, it's presence. It's domination. It's the quiet assertion of superiority. And this is the part that most people struggle to understand. When someone hurts you, your instinct is to reach for understanding, to seek closure, to try to reconcile what just happened with the person you thought they were. But a narcissist knows this. In fact, they count on it. There's a concept in psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It's a powerful conditioning method where rewards are given inconsistently, just enough to keep someone hooked, like a gambler pulling a slot machine. Narcissists employ this with silence. One moment they're intense, connected, even affectionate, then the next they vanish. And after they've wounded you emotionally, they withdraw entirely. Why? Because silence in the wake of emotional injury confuses the human mind. We are social creatures, wired for connection. When that connection is abruptly severed, especially by someone we trusted, the disorientation is profound. Now, let's not romanticize this as some tragic flaw in the narcissist. This is not a broken child simply acting out. This is strategy, a way to retain power in a dynamic where power is everything. By ignoring you, they remove your ability to engage. You can't argue. You can't clarify. You can't heal. And in that vacuum, your mind becomes a war zone. You replay what happened. You question yourself. You internalize blame. You spiral. And all the while, they maintain psychological dominance without having to lift a finger. There's a philosophical layer to this too. Think about what silence symbolizes in the context of relationship. It's not just the absence of words. It's the denial of recognition. The message is clear. You don't exist to me right now. And that's devastating because it threatens the very core of your identity, your sense of relational worth. The narcissist, by withdrawing, is essentially saying, I determine when you are seen and when you are invisible. That's not just emotional abuse, it's existential manipulation. What makes this particularly insidious is that many people misinterpret this silence as a reflection of their own failure. Did I overreact? Did I push them away? Am I too sensitive? These are the kinds of thoughts that rush in when someone who hurt you suddenly disappears. And again, this benefits the narcissist. They don't have to apologize. They don't have to explain. They just get to vanish while you stay behind doing the emotional labor for them. Now, we need to be brutally honest here. This works only if you let it. The power of their silence is proportional to your need for their voice. If you seek closure from someone who gains power by denying it, you've already given them control. That's the trap. The narcissist doesn't ignore you because they're done with you. They ignore you because they know you're not done with them. That's where the control lives. In your response, in your longing, in your repeated attempts to reach out. And each unanswered message, each sleepless night, each emotional spiral reinforces their sense of power. So what's the alternative? It's not detachment in the cold sense, not indifference born of bitterness. It's clarity. You need to recognize that silence in this context is not neutrality, it's manipulation. It's not peace, it's pressure. You are being taught in a subtle and sinister way to associate love with absence, closeness with chaos, and attention with pain. And the longer you stay in that psychological loop, the more normalized it becomes. That's how emotional dependency is built. Not through kindness, but through confusion. This is why it's so crucial to reclaim your inner authority, To stop interpreting silence as a mystery to be solved and instead see it for what it is, a tool, a weapon in the narcissist's arsenal. When you realize that, something shifts. You no longer chase, you no longer beg, you no longer contort yourself into something more acceptable just to be noticed again. Because you understand that their silence says nothing about your worth and everything about their need to control it. We often talk about reclaiming power, but here's the truth. Power is not something they took from you. It's something you handed over, often unknowingly. And you can take it back the moment you decide that your value is not up for negotiation, especially not with someone who confuses love with leverage. So when a narcissist hurts you and then ignores you, don't ask, why are they doing this to me? Ask instead, why am I still giving them the authority to define what I deserve? That's the turning point. One of the most unsettling aspects of dealing with a narcissist is how quickly they vanish after causing harm. Just as you're reeling, trying to process the emotional chaos they've unleashed, they go silent. They disappear. And for most people, this is deeply confusing because naturally we assume that if someone has hurt us, they must at least acknowledge it, apologize, reflect, explain. But a narcissist doesn't operate on that emotional frequency. They don't process guilt or accountability in the same way a psychologically integrated person does. In fact, they avoid it like the plague. At the heart of narcissism is a fragile, inflated sense of self. That might sound contradictory. How can someone seem so arrogant and yet be so insecure? But that's exactly the paradox. The grandiosity is a mask. It's a carefully constructed persona designed to protect a wounded ego. And any suggestion that they've done something wrong, that they've caused harm, that they need to take responsibility, that threatens the entire illusion. It cracks the mirror they spend their whole lives trying to keep intact. So what do? Instead of taking responsibility? They flee. They ignore. They deny. Because to face the truth of their own actions would mean confronting a part of themselves they've spent years, sometimes decades, avoiding. And this is where the philosophical layer becomes critical. Accountability demands self-reflection. It demands humility. It demands an acknowledgement that I am not perfect and my actions have consequences. For the narcissist, that kind of admission is not just difficult, it's intolerable. Because their identity depends on being right, being superior, being untouchable. Now, in a healthy psyche, when you hurt someone, there's an internal signal: guilt, remorse, a desire to repair. These emotions are uncomfortable, yes, but they serve a function. They preserve relationships, they orient us toward truth. But a narcissist experiences these signals as threats. And so, instead of leaning in, they shut down, or worse, they project. They twist the narrative so that you become the problem. You're too sensitive. You misunderstood. You provoked them. And in this way, they dodge accountability while simultaneously eroding your sense of clarity. This dynamic creates a psychological imbalance that's deeply damaging to the person on the receiving end, because you're left not only with the pain of the original wound, but also with the additional burden of confusion. You're stuck trying to figure out what just happened, why they won't acknowledge it, and whether it was somehow your fault. This is a classic narcissistic defense mechanism: deny the injury, deflect the blame, disappear from the aftermath. That way they preserve their fragile ego while you're left holding the emotional weight of a two-person problem. The tragedy is that many people internalize this. They absorb the silence as a form of judgment. If they're ignoring me after what happened, maybe I really did overreact. Maybe I was too much. Maybe I drove them away. But this is not truth. It's trauma logic. And it stems from the assumption that emotionally mature behavior is the default in others. It's not. Emotional maturity is a discipline. It requires self-honesty. It requires the courage to admit wrongdoing. Narcissists are often intelligent, articulate, even charismatic, but none of that implies maturity. In fact, many use those traits to mask their emotional underdevelopment. When a narcissist ignores you, after hurting you, they are avoiding the confrontation with themselves. And that should tell you something important. Not just about them, but about how you respond. See, the real question isn't just why they won't take accountability. It's why you continue to wait for it. Why do you remain emotionally tethered to someone who has demonstrated they cannot or will not reflect on their behavior? This is where the deeper psychological work begins. It's not just about seeing the narcissist clearly. It's about seeing yourself clearly. What need is being activated in you that makes their silence so intolerable? Is it a fear of abandonment? A desire to fix? A hope that if you just explain it right, they'll finally understand? All of these are human instincts. But when dealing with a narcissist, they become vulnerabilities for further exploitation. So you have to pivot. You have to stop expecting the narcissist to wake up and see what they've done. That fantasy only keeps you stuck. Instead, begin asking a different question. What is my responsibility now that I know the truth? That is the beginning of self-reclamation. Because once you recognize that their silence is not confusion, but avoidance, strategic, self-protective avoidance, you stop begging for clarity from someone who's invested in distortion. And that shift, though painful, is profoundly liberating. You can't force someone to be accountable, but you can stop waiting for them to become someone they're not. And maybe that's the lesson. Accountability is not just something we seek from others, it's something we must reclaim for ourselves. There's a common misconception when it comes to the way narcissists withdraw after conflict. People often assume that their silence signals detachment or indifference or emotional exhaustion. But that's not what's happening. Not really. When a narcissist ignores you after hurting you, it isn't because they're overwhelmed or uncertain. It's because they're punishing you. And the punishment is psychological in nature. The silence is meant to inflict doubt, distress, and emotional destabilization. This is not passivity. It's a calculated move. You have to understand how power functions in the mind of a narcissist. Relationships aren't mutual exchanges based on love, trust, or shared meaning. They are arenas of control. Every interaction becomes a subtle contest over dominance. So when you push back or express hurt or try to hold them accountable, that registers as a threat. And how do they respond to threats? Not with openness or repair. No, they respond with withdrawal. But it's a withdrawal that stings because it's deliberate. It's meant to hurt you more than their words ever could. This is what makes the silent treatment so damaging. It plays directly into our deepest human fears. We're social beings, hardwired for connection. And when someone you care about suddenly vanishes from emotional view, especially after doing harm, it creates a psychological wound that's hard to name. You're left not only dealing with what happened, but also with the eerie silence that follows. The unanswered calls, the cold stares, the vanishing presence. It feels like emotional exile, and that's exactly what it's meant to feel like. The narcissist is saying, without ever saying it, you crossed a line. You're now being punished. And I will acknowledge you again only when you've learned your place. That's the message. It's not about reconciliation, it's about obedience. They want you to submit, to question yourself, to regret standing up for your dignity. The silence is a behavioral correction tool, like how a trainer punishes a dog, only this isn't training. It's domination disguised as distance. Now, here's where it becomes psychologically complex. If you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where affection was earned through compliance, then this dynamic might feel familiar, even comfortable in a twisted way. You begin to believe that if you just apologize, if you just explain better, if you just soften your tone, maybe the narcissist will re-engage. And so you chase the very person who just punished you. You internalize the pain as proof that you did something wrong. This is where the narcissist's power multiplies, because now you're doing their work for them. And let's be honest, this isn't just emotional manipulation, it's emotional conditioning. It creates a loop. Pain, withdrawal, self-blame, pursuit. Then, if and when the narcissist finally reappears, maybe with charm, maybe with cold civility, it feels like relief, like the storm has passed. But what you're really experiencing is the cycle of abuse completing itself. You've been punished, you've submitted, and now the connection is restored on their terms. What makes this cycle so hard to break is that it's not always dramatic. It can be subtle, even covert. Narcissists are often experts at controlling others without raising their voice, without making a scene. The silence itself becomes the weapon. And because it's so quiet, so seemingly passive, it's hard to name, hard to point to. You might try to tell someone, they're ignoring me, and be met with confusion. So what? Maybe they just need space. But that misses the point. This isn't about space. It's about power. When someone cares for you, truly cares, they don't ignore you to prove a point. They don't disappear to win a fight. Silence in a healthy relationship might be used for reflection, for peace, for regulation, but not for punishment. That's the dividing line. That's what you have to learn to discern. So what do you do when you find yourself in this dynamic? First, you stop personalizing their silence. Understand what it is. A tactic, not a truth. Their withdrawal doesn't define your worth. It reflects their inability to relate in a mature and accountable way. Second, you resist the urge to break the silence just to make the discomfort go away. That's what they're counting on. They want you to reach out, to apologize, to admit fault where there is none. And third, you recenter. You come back to yourself. You ask, what values do I want to live by in this moment? Dignity or desperation? Integrity or appeasement? Because the truth is this, the silent treatment only works on those who believe they deserve it. You don't. You never did. And the moment you realize that, truly realize it, you begin to disarm the narcissist's power over you. You stop dancing to the rhythm of their emotional games. You choose clarity over chaos. And in doing so, you send a powerful message, not to them, but to yourself. You are not someone to be punished into silence. You are someone who deserves to be heard, respected, and treated with dignity, even when you're not perfect. Especially then. What's essential to understand, if we're going to speak honestly about this, is that narcissists don't ignore you after hurting you because they feel remorse or because they're trying to cool down. They ignore you because it feeds them. Not in the physical sense, but in the psychological and emotional sense. Your confusion, your pain, your anxiety, it all becomes fuel. You're not dealing with someone who sees relationship as a place for mutual growth or shared vulnerability. You're dealing with someone who sees it as a stage. And on that stage, your emotional suffering becomes their applause. Now that might sound dark, even cynical, But it's also profoundly accurate when viewed through a psychological lens. The narcissistic ego is built on fragility. It's not stable, and it's certainly not self-sustaining. That's why it constantly needs external reinforcement, praise, admiration, attention. These aren't luxuries to the narcissist. They're necessities. And when those aren't available through admiration, they'll settle for something far more toxic. Control through emotional chaos. You see, if they can't get you to praise them, they'll provoke you. If they can't be adored, they'll settle for being feared or chased or obsessed over. Because in their mind, attention of any kind is evidence of significance. And so when they hurt you and you react, when you spiral emotionally, when you send long messages trying to understand what went wrong, they don't see your pain. They see their power. They see that they still matter, that they can still affect you. And that gives them a psychological high. It tells them, I am still in control. This is one of the hardest truths for people to accept, especially those with empathetic or nurturing personalities. You want to believe that everyone fundamentally means well, that hurt people, that if someone is behaving this way, it must be coming from a place of inner pain. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes, let's not be naive, it's not pain, it's strategy, it's ego preservation, it's gratification. And that distinction matters. Because if you assume every narcissistic act is unintentional, you'll keep trying to heal someone who isn't interested in healing. You'll keep giving compassion to someone who is feeding on your emotional availability. And while that might feel morally righteous, it's also incredibly dangerous. Because you're not just giving kindness, you're offering reinforcement. You're rewarding the very behavior that's causing you harm. And in the narcissist's mind, every time you break the silence, every time you seek resolution, you're not seen as strong, or you're seen as weak, as controllable, as a source they can return to again and again for their emotional fix. And there's a philosophical point here that we can't overlook. Power dynamics in human relationships are not always overt. They often play out in the subtle interactions, in the tone of a conversation, in who gets the last word, in who feels seen and who is ignored. And when one person is emotionally invested and the other is emotionally manipulative, it creates an imbalance. That imbalance becomes the engine of control. And unless you become aware of it, unless you name it, it will quietly govern the entire relationship. This is why your pain becomes so valuable to a narcissist. It means you still care. It means they still have access. And even more disturbingly, it means they can re-engage at any time on their terms. Because when someone controls your emotional responses, they control your behavior, they control your thoughts. They become the central figure in your psychological world, even when they're physically absent. Now, the good news, if we're willing to call it that, is that this dynamic only continues as long as you remain reactive. The moment you detach, not with bitterness, but with clarity, the narcissist loses their fuel. They become irrelevant. And for someone whose entire sense of self is built on being significant, that is the deepest injury of all. But here's the challenge. Detachment requires more than distance. It requires reorienting your entire framework. It requires moving from a reaction-based mindset to a value-based one. Instead of asking, how can I get them to see my pain? You ask, what kind of person do I want to be, regardless of whether they acknowledge it? That's the shift. That's where you start to reclaim yourself. Because at some point you have to stop proving your pain to people who benefit from it. You have to stop handing emotional power to those who misuse it. And you have to realize, perhaps with some discomfort, that the person who hurt you is not seeking reconciliation. They're seeking reinforcement. They're not interested in your healing. They're invested in your hurt, because your hurt keeps them central. So don't give them the satisfaction. Don't let your suffering become their supply. You deserve more than to be someone's emotional mirror, constantly reflecting back their sense of control and superiority. And maybe that's the deeper truth in all of this. Real power isn't in how much you feel. It's in what you choose to do with those feelings. There's a pattern that reveals itself over time once you've been in enough relationships, or even just one with a narcissist. After they've hurt you, after they've ignored you, after they've twisted the narrative to make you question your sanity, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel isolated, not just from them, but from yourself, from the world, from reality. And that's not accidental. That's the point. One of the most devastating psychological tactics narcissists employ is emotional distancing to disorient your sense of truth. Now, let's be precise. We're not talking about physical distance. We're talking about a deliberate, carefully engineered form of emotional disconnection. They create confusion, not by shouting or arguing, but by withholding. They stop responding to your pain. They withdraw validation. They act indifferent in the moments you most need empathy. And this lack of engagement, this flat refusal to acknowledge your reality, begins to erode your internal compass. You start to question, am I overreacting? Did I misread this? Maybe they're not that bad. Maybe I am the problem. That's the psychological trap. Narcissists don't need to be uncertain, because in uncertainty, they gain the upper hand. When you no longer trust your emotions, when you start to hesitate before expressing your needs or boundaries, they've already won the battle. That hesitation is the signal. It tells them you're malleable, that your sense of self is weakening. And that's when the real manipulation deepens. This process, what psychologists sometimes call gaslighting, is not always overt. It doesn't always look like someone telling you that your version of events is wrong. Sometimes it's just the strategic silence after you share something vulnerable. It's the sudden coldness after you open your heart. It's the subtle eye roll, the dry okay, the refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue. These are all tools. And they're used for one central reason: to detach you from your reality so you'll become more dependent on theirs. Let's go deeper. Philosophically speaking, your sense of truth, your perception of reality, is the foundation of your identity. When someone distorts that, even slightly, they're not just confusing you, they're altering how you see the world, and more critically, how you see yourself. And when that distortion happens over time, it leaves you in a psychological fog. You know something is wrong, but you can't name it. You feel off balance, but you can't locate the cause. And because the narcissist remains emotionally elusive, offering no resolution, you begin to internalize that confusion as a personal flaw. This is where the real damage occurs. You start to distrust your own emotions. You suppress your instincts. You shrink. You become hesitant, cautious, constantly monitoring your words, your tone, your reactions. Not because you're afraid of overt abuse, but because you fear the emotional distance, the chilling void they impose when they're displeased. That emotional distance becomes your punishment, your teacher, your cage. And that's the tragedy. Because once you begin to accept that emotional unavailability as normal, as deserved, as your fault, you become easier to control. And let's not soften the truth here. That is the goal. The narcissist doesn't want a relationship based on mutual recognition. They want a dynamic where they set the terms, where your emotional reality is contingent on their approval. And the more they can disconnect you from your inner truth, the more power they wield over your life. But this kind of manipulation only works if you stay confused. The moment you start to notice the pattern, not just the individual episodes of silence or blame shifting, but the structure of the entire emotional game, you reclaim power. Because awareness cuts through fog like a blade. When you can name the dynamic, you begin to anchor back into yourself. You start to say, no, this doesn't feel right. I don't need permission to trust what I feel. I don't need their validation to believe what I experience. That clarity is everything. It's the beginning of psychological freedom. And let's be honest, freedom doesn't come without grief. Because part of waking up from this disorientation is facing the truth. The person you hoped would love you, protect you, or at least respect you, has no interest in meeting you in reality. They thrive in distortion. They flourish in ambiguity. And if you want to reclaim your sanity, you have to walk away from their world. Not always physically, though sometimes that's necessary, but emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. You have to draw a line, not to punish them, but to preserve yourself. It's not easy. There will be moments of self-doubt where you'll be tempted to return to the familiar fog just because clarity feels too painful. But remember, pain with clarity is 1,000 times better than comfort in delusion. Because at least with clarity, you can rebuild, you can heal, you can grow. Fog only keeps you lost. So if you find yourself questioning your emotions, doubting your reality, feeling distant from the truth you once knew, pause, reflect, and ask yourself, whose voice am I really listening to? Mine or theirs? Because your truth doesn't require their permission. It just requires your courage. Let's talk about what happens after the narcissist hurts you, ignores you, and vanishes into silence. Because there's a subtle yet profound illusion that begins to take root in your mind, often without you even realizing it. You start to believe that their absence is about you. That somehow, if you had just done something differently, if you'd been more patient, less reactive, more accommodating, maybe things wouldn't have ended up this way. Maybe they wouldn't be silent. Maybe they wouldn't have walked away so easily. This is the final twist of the knife. The belief that their withdrawal is evidence of your inadequacy. But it isn't. Their silence, their distance, their indifference, it's not about you. It's about them. Their lack of empathy, their unwillingness to repair, their refusal to face the consequences of their actions. Those are signs of their limitations, not yours. Yet, because you've been entangled in a psychological game of distortion and control, you're conditioned to assume responsibility, not just for your own behavior, but for theirs as well. That's how the narcissist keeps control, even in absence. They leave the room, but they stay in your mind. And this is where we have to make something painfully clear. The narcissist's silence after hurting you is not a sign of moral superiority. It's not a gesture of maturity or emotional discipline. It's avoidance. It's cowardice dressed up as detachment. They ignore you not because they've risen above the situation, but because they can't face what they've done. They can't tolerate vulnerability. Not yours, and certainly not their own. So rather than confront the emotional mess they've made, they vanish and force you to carry the weight. You carry the guilt, you carry the questions, you carry the pain, and they walk away clean But the silence is also strategic. Let's not pretend this is simply emotional immaturity.